The war-ravaged planet of Tarna had seen better days. Once a thriving hub of intergalactic commerce, it now lay in ruins, its cities reduced to crumbling skeletons, its fields scorched by endless battles. Yet, amidst the chaos, a fragile peace was within reach. Or at least, that was the hope when the Council of 12 called for a ceasefire. Elias stood at the edge of the ruined capital, looking out at the desolate landscape. His assignment was simple: help the factions come to an agreement, facilitate the peace talks, and get out before things got worse. He'd been hired as a mercenary for his experience in delicate negotiations and his ability to read people. But even he knew that this mission was different. There were no guarantees here, only dangers, secrets, and a war that didn't seem to have a clear end in sight. The sound of footsteps broke Elias from his thoughts. He turned to see his contact approaching. A short, wiry man who wore the marks of someone who'd been in too many battles. His name was Garrick, and he was the liaison between the human mercenary groups and the local factions. "Elias," Garrick said, nodding toward the makeshift camp where the talks were to take place. "They're expecting you." Elias didn't respond immediately. Instead, he scanned the horizon, his thoughts still on the mission. A peace treaty was something he had negotiated in the past, but something told him this one wouldn't go smoothly. There were too many factions, too many old wounds, and some enemies were too stubborn to lay down their weapons. But he had a job to do, and that meant focusing on the task at hand. "Let's get to it," he said, following Garrick toward the camp. As they walked, the air grew thicker with tension. The planet's atmosphere, once vibrant with life, now carried the weight of its people's suffering. They reached the camp just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the dusty ground. A large tent stood in the center, surrounded by armed guards, their eyes sharp and alert. Inside the tent, several figures were already gathered, leaders from the different factions. Some were humanoid. Others were alien species that Elias could barely identify. They were a motley crew, each with their own agendas and loyalties. The situation was volatile, and he had to tread carefully.
"Elias," Garrick said, gesturing to a tall woman standing near the table in the center.
"This is Lyra. She's important to the talks." Elias looked at her, and his breath caught in his chest. The woman before him was unlike anyone he had ever seen. She had striking blue skin that shimmered like the surface of a distant ocean. Her hair, dark as night, was pulled back into a tight braid that cascaded down her back. But it wasn't just her appearance that left him speechless. It was the air of quiet power that surrounded her. Her gaze met his, and in that moment, Elias felt as though she could see right through him, as though she knew his every thought, his every hesitation. Lyra's eyes were the color of molten gold, fierce and unyielding. Her expression was unreadable, but her presence was undeniable. She didn't offer a hand to shake, nor did she speak. She simply stood there, waiting. "Lyra," Garrick said, his voice respectful but cautious. "This is Elias. He's here to assist with the talks." For a moment, there was silence. Then, Lyra gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't threatening either. There was something about it that left Elias unsettled, though he couldn't quite place why. "It's a pleasure," she said, her voice smooth, but with an edge of something Elias couldn't quite decipher. Her accent was soft, alien, but the words were clear. Elias offered a nod, trying to keep his composure. Likewise. For a moment, the room seemed to close in on him. There were too many eyes on him, too many people waiting for something, anything, to happen. Lyra, however, didn't break her gaze. It felt like a challenge, though he wasn't sure what she was challenging him with. He knew nothing about her, but there was something in the way she stood, the way she observed everything around her, that made him uneasy. She wasn't just a negotiator, she was a warrior. He could tell by the way she carried herself. "Shall we begin?" Lyra asked, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Garrick gave a small nod, and Elias followed suit. They all sat around the large table, the discussions beginning immediately. But as the hours passed, Elias found his focus drifting. Every so often his mind would return to Lyra, her presence lingering in the background of his thoughts. She spoke little, but when she did, her words were sharp, calculated. She didn't speak for the sake of speaking. Each word carried weight, each statement a carefully measured move. As the meeting stretched on, Elias realized he couldn't stop thinking about her. Despite her reputation, one that Garrick had warned him about earlier, there was something about her that intrigued him. Lyra wasn't just a skilled negotiator. She was someone who had earned her place in the galaxy through sheer force of will. And yet, there was a strange sense of vulnerability in her eyes, a depth that Elias couldn't quite understand. The sun had long since set, and the camp had grown quieter. The other leaders were still in heated discussions, but Elias was beginning to feel the strain of the long hours. He stood up, stepping outside the tent for a moment to clear his head. The cool night air hit him like a wave, refreshing but heavy with the weight of the planet's pain. The stars above were dim, hidden by the smoke and ash that still lingered in the atmosphere. He leaned against a nearby structure, staring up at the sky. As he stood there, trying to gather his thoughts, he heard footsteps approach from behind. "Elias!" a voice called. It was Lyra's voice. He turned around to see her standing a few feet away, her gaze locked on him with an intensity that made his heart race. "I didn't expect you to be out here," she said, her voice smooth and measured. "I needed a break," Elias replied, trying to keep his tone casual. "This place, it's a lot to take in." Lyra nodded. "Yes. The weight of it all can be overwhelming." She stepped closer, her presence almost magnetic. "But you're used to it, aren't you?"
Elias glanced at her, unsure of how to respond.
Her eyes seemed to pierce through him, reading him in a way that made him feel exposed. "I've seen my fair share," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was talking about the war or something else entirely. For a moment, they stood in silence. The camp behind them seemed distant, almost unreal. It was just the two of them now, alone in the quiet of the night. And for the first time since arriving on Tarna, Elias felt like he wasn't just a mercenary anymore. He was a man, standing face to face with a woman whose past was as mysterious as her blue skin. "I know what they say about me," Lyra said suddenly, breaking the silence. "The assassinations. The bloodshed. They think I'm just a killer." Elias met her gaze, feeling a strange sense of sympathy for her. He hadn't heard the full story, but he knew the rumors. The galaxy feared her. And yet, there was more to her than that. He could see it in the way she carried herself, in the way she had spoken to the others. She wasn't just a weapon. "You're not just a killer," Elias said quietly, surprising himself with his words. "People have histories, I get that." Lyra's lips quirked upward, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "You're different from the others." Elias didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't sure what kind of person she thought he was. He'd only just met her, and yet something about this moment felt significant. He couldn't explain why. "I don't judge you for what you've done," he said finally, his voice steady. "I just want to see this peace happen." Lyra studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "I hope you get what you want, Elias. But sometimes peace comes at a cost. A cost you may not be willing to pay." Her words lingered in the air as she turned and walked back toward the camp, leaving Elias standing in the quiet night, wondering what the future held for them both. The days passed quickly on Tarna, the fragile ceasefire giving the factions a brief moment of peace. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Elias spent most of his time in the camp, sitting in on negotiations and trying to keep the various leaders from tearing each other apart. He had seen his fair share of high-stakes talks, but nothing like this. There was too much history, too many grudges, too many years of bloodshed. The stakes were higher than he'd anticipated. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, Elias couldn't stop thinking about Lyra. She was everywhere, at the negotiations, watching him from across the camp, appearing in the quiet moments when he was alone. The way she moved, the way her eyes held a calm, dangerous confidence, left him unsettled. She was a mystery he couldn't solve, and it both fascinated and disturbed him. On the third day, the tension reached its breaking point. The ceasefire was holding, but the negotiations weren't going anywhere. The leaders were at an impasse, and Elias could feel the room closing in on him. He knew they needed a breakthrough, something to get the factions to set aside their pride and focus on a shared future. But the more he tried to push them toward agreement, the more the cracks showed. They couldn't agree on anything, and as the hours dragged on, the frustration began to build. Elias excused himself from the table and stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The night had fallen again, but the sky was thick with smoke, making the stars barely visible. The air smelled of burning metal and ash, a constant reminder of the war that had ravaged the planet. He leaned against a wall, trying to calm his thoughts. He'd been trained to handle these situations, to navigate the impossible and find common ground. But this felt different. This wasn't just a simple peace process. It was a matter of survival. If these factions didn't come to an agreement soon, Tarna would be lost forever. Elias ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The stakes had never felt so high, and he was beginning to question whether his presence here was helping or making things worse. He thought back to the first time he had met Lyra. Her calmness in the face of such chaos had been unsettling, but there was something more to her than just the deadly reputation that preceded her. As if summoned by his thoughts, Lyra appeared in the doorway of the camp. Her silhouette was barely visible in the dim light, but Elias could tell it was her. She stood there for a moment, watching him, before stepping forward. The air seemed to shift around her as she approached, her presence commanding without a word. "I can feel the tension," she said, her voice low but clear. "It's almost palpable." Elias nodded, not trusting himself to speak at first. "It's not going well. I don't know how much longer we can keep them from fighting again." Lyra's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained guarded. Sometimes, the hardest battles aren't fought with weapons. Elias turned to face her fully, surprised by the depth of her words. She wasn't just talking about the factions. She was talking about herself, about the way she had lived her life. Her reputation as an assassin, a killer, had preceded her. But Elias was beginning to understand that there was more to her than the bloodshed she had left in her wake. She was a survivor, someone who had endured unimaginable challenges and come out stronger for it. "You're right," Elias said after a moment. "But these people, they've been at war for so long, it's hard to convince them to trust anything, let alone each other." Lyra took a step closer, her golden eyes locking onto his. "Trust isn't given, it's earned, and sometimes it's earned through action, not words."
Elias swallowed hard.
There was something about her, something that made him believe she understood the weight of what they were facing. He had never met anyone like her before. She was both a threat and an ally, both a puzzle and a solution. It was hard to know where he stood with her, but he couldn't deny the connection that had begun to form between them. "You make it sound so simple," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Nothing about this is simple, Elias. But if you want peace, you'll have to fight for it. You'll have to do things you never thought you could." Elias turned away, staring out at the landscape once again. He was a soldier, a mercenary. He had fought in countless battles, had seen the horrors of war firsthand. But this was different. The war on Tarna wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about saving lives, about forging something that could endure long after the weapons were put down. "I'm not sure I can do this," Elias confessed, the weight of the mission pressing down on him. I don't know if I'm the right person for this job. Lyra stepped closer, her voice soft but steady.
You're exactly the person who can do this. You have the courage to face what others won't. That's what matters.
He looked at her, meeting her gaze for the first time since the conversation had started. Her eyes were full of something he couldn't quite name. Respect, perhaps, or understanding. But there was a quiet certainty in them, a conviction that Elias didn't feel in himself. I'm not sure about that, he said, his voice low, but I'll try. Lyra studied him for a moment, as if weighing his words. Then, without saying another word, she turned and walked back into the camp, her movements graceful and fluid. Elias stood there for a while, thinking about what she had said. He had always believed that the key to peace was negotiation, that words could heal wounds, that weapons had opened. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that words alone weren't enough. Trust had to be rebuilt, piece by piece, and sometimes it took a spark to ignite the fire of change. Later that evening, Elias returned to the tent, where the negotiations were taking place. The leaders were still at odds, their voices rising in frustration as they pointed fingers and accused each other of betrayal. Elias sighed, stepping forward to address the group. Enough, he said, his voice firm. We've been sitting here for hours, and we're getting nowhere. It's time to face the truth. If we don't act now, this planet will burn, and all of you will lose everything. So, we need to make a decision. What are we willing to fight for? What are we willing to lose? The room fell silent. Elias could feel the weight of their eyes on him, the pressure mounting with every passing second. You want peace, he continued. Then show me you're willing to fight for it. Show me that you're willing to let go of your pride and put the needs of your people first. Because if we don't, there will be nothing left to save. There was a long pause, and for a moment, Elias thought he had failed. But then, one of the leaders, a tall, imposing figure from the western sector, spoke up. I don't like it, he said, his voice gruff. But he's right. We can't keep fighting like this. We'll either work together, or we'll all die alone. Slowly, others began to speak, agreeing to the terms Elias had laid out. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. The tension in the room began to ease, just a little. They had agreed to a framework for peace, a tentative step toward reconciliation. As the meeting wound down, Elias stepped outside to gather his thoughts. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they had made progress. He had done his part, and as he walked away from the camp, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Lyra was waiting for him again, standing near the edge of the camp, her eyes fixed on him as he approached. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need for words. You did it, she said finally, her voice soft but full of something he couldn't name. Elias gave a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. We did it, Lyra nodded, her expression unreadable. It's only the beginning, Elias, but it's a good start. And for the first time since arriving on Tarna, Elias felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for real peace. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, it felt possible.